Hi again, my name is Samantha Ho. I'm the Communications Officer at Christ College Sydney, and this week we have Scott Rae, who's joining us for a week of intensives and events, particularly speaking about bioethics, infertility and reproductive technologies. But perhaps one thing you might not know about Scott is he's a prolific author and researcher in the area of work and vocation. And today we'd just like to ask him some questions about that. So Scott, just in case our audience haven't met you before, what's your day job?
My day job is I wear three hats.
Only three?
Yeah, I guess that around here that's not saying much. But I've been a professor of Christian ethics at Biola University, Talbot School of Theology for the last 30 years. I also serve as Dean of Faculty for the School of Theology, which means all the faculty report to me, and I'm sort of in charge of faculty hiring, development, things like that. I also serve as a senior advisor to the president of Biola University for university mission, ensuring that, helping the president ensure that the university doesn't drift from its original mission and from those moorings. So it's a lot to do. I don't teach as much as I'd like to, but we're working on that in the future. That's why it's so fun to be here.
Yes.
This is the first time in 30 years that I've not had a regular class that I'm teaching because of these leadership roles. So getting in front of students during this intensive this week has just been so life-giving. It's been so much fun. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here.
Yes, and our students have been enjoying every minute of it. Now, there's one centre within Biola University, is that right? Is it Talbot Centre?
The Talbot Center.
For Faith, Work and Economics. So what is that centre and how did it come about?
The Talbot Center for Faith, Work and Economics it's what I call a church consulting arm of Talbot School of Theology in the area of work, economics, and vocation. Helping equip churches to get this discussion of work and vocation into the DNA of the church. Not just be an add-on or something that is a one-off that they just do once to talk about and then let it go, but to get this actually into the fabric of the life of the church. We've recognized for so long with our seminary students and with our business students in the university. I teach in the business school as well. That the idea of calling and vocation doesn't just relate to pastoral ministry or to the mission field. God calls men and women to a variety of different occupations with the same sense of calling and the same sense of importance and value to their work as we would assign to pastoral ministry and to the mission field. For example, we have there's a big banner among our business, it's probably about the size of that window, that hangs from the rafters of the business school building right as you walk in the door that says business as ministry. And I think they got it right in the way they stated that, because what they're arguing with that is that the very work of business is a person's ministry in the same way that pastoring is a pastor's ministry and evangelism is the missionary's ministry. And so to see, we try to, the most common term in the New Testament that we translate ministry is diakonia, which is actually more commonly rendered service. And so if we see business as service to God, I think that may be a little easier to get your arms around that idea, because the concept of ministry still has, it's just people assume that means that you're getting a paycheck from a church or some other Christian organization, when in reality, we try to help churches recognize that all believers are in full-time ministry. They're all in full-time service, regardless of where they get a paycheck from. And they entered full-time service at the moment they came to faith, not at the moment where they decided where their paycheck was going to come from. And so people don't leave the ministry when they step down from a church. They just change arenas of service. We found that still is widely misunderstood, and how that affects the average working person who comes into our churches, who hear that pastors and missionaries are in full-time ministry, but everybody else is either in part-time or no-time ministry, which I think, according to biblical teaching, neither of those things are true. that regardless of your arena of service, you are in full-time service for King Jesus, regardless of where you get a paycheck from. And so the center is designed to get that type of thinking about people's work into the life and fabric of the local church. And so we encourage churches to think about the language that they use when they talk about their ministry. We encourage them to forsake language of higher callings, for example. We encourage churches to stop talking about secular jobs. Because if it's true that the reformers gave their lives to abolish that sacred secular dichotomy, then all work under God's creation, unless it's intrinsically evil, is considered part of God's rule and part of God's sacred work. And so getting people to grasp that and to get that into the life of the church, pastoral practices that can change, we try to encourage people to do that. It's just been a wonderful ministry. My colleague Helen Mitchell is the one who runs the day-to-day operation of the center. It's been funded by a very generous grant from a foundation in the United States that came out of the person who invented the portable generator years ago. And so the foundation has funded this because they have a vision for seeing the next generation of pastors and churches get this right theologically, so that people will recognize that what God calls people to do in the workplace has just as much nobility and value to God as what God calls people to do in the pastorate or on the mission field.
So let's say maybe a congregation member comes up to you and says, I don't feel like my work is as important as what a pastor might do throughout the week. How would you respond to that sort of statement?
Well, I take them, I think, first to the biblical text in Colossians 3, 23 and 24, where Paul is actually speaking to household servants. Verse 22 says, slaves, obey your masters. 23 says, assume slaves or servants in whatever you do, which is a pretty big umbrella, right? In whatever you do your work heartily as unto the Lord. 4, verse 24, parentheses, I think is intent, for in whatever you do, it's the Lord Christ whom you are serving. I think what I would write to is that Paul affirms that even the lowliest, most menial, mindless grunt work that you can imagine was considered a part, not all of it, but a part of a person's service to Christ. And so I would say what you do in the workplace is just as much service to Christ in a different arena of service as what pastors and missionaries are doing. Now, it may be that with your particular gifts and skills and passions, you may be especially wired to be a pastor or to be on the mission field. But I think you might also be specifically wired to be an accountant or to be a financial analyst or to be a communications director or to be an attorney or to be a plumber or a construction worker, whatever it might be. All those jobs, all those vocations have intrinsic value because they're a part of what it means for human beings to exercise dominion over creation. I think God is portrayed throughout the Scripture as a worker. I think that's part of what it actually means to be made in His image, that we are His representatives in our various workplaces. So I would suggest that people who think that they are doing something second best for God's kingdom, I don't think have read the Scripture fully in this. And we tell, part of the interesting thing is I'll ask people in the workplace, I say, so tell me about your ministry in the workplace. And they say things like, I lead a Bible study at my office when I can, or I pray for my coworkers. I try to share my faith when I have the opportunity. And I point out to them after they give me a list of those things, I say, that's all great stuff. But those are all those things that you're doing when you're not doing your job. And it's very rare, actually, that somebody considers the very work that they do as part of their service to God in the workplace. And I think that's the big takeaway. That the very work you do is service to Christ and His kingdom building. Because most of the work that we do contributes to human flourishing, it contributes to our communities, it contributes to the common good. Now there's some work that's intrinsically evil, like I'm still waiting for somebody to say, well, I think God's calling me to be a Playboy photographer. Yeah, probably not. But those things that are intrinsically evil, those are obviously off the table. But I'll give you an example of this. We've got good friends who were coming back from a vacation overseas years ago. And his wife, they're coming off the airplane on the jetway, she collapsed, unconscious. Turns out she has a small tumor about that big at the base of her brain that had caused her blackout. Emergency neurosurgery, to make a long story short. She recovered, went home the same day, and is totally fine today. My friend's reflecting on all the occupations that had to come together to facilitate his wife's healing. He was particularly enamored with the team, maybe an individual, who wrote the imaging software that enabled the surgeon to pinpoint exactly where the tumor was and to get it out with minimal collateral damage to the brain. You know what he said? He said, I am so glad that the person who wrote that imaging software didn't decide to leave their business to go serve the Lord full time. Because that's what they've been doing. Yeah. And I think he got it just right. And I think part of this is, I think we have a defective view of a human being, because we are more than just, as my friend puts it, we're more than just a soul on a stick. We're bodies. God created our bodies. Jesus took on a body, which says that our bodily stuff is important. Jesus came actually into the world to redeem the world, which tells us that our salvation is not just for our own benefit, but it's for the life of the world. And so if God's redeeming all of the world, if all creation's groaning for its redemption, then it seems to me that all of those areas in which God's at work, redeeming creation, matter to Him, and our work in those areas, therefore, has kingdom value to Him.
So one of my next questions is, you talked about the sacred-secular divide. How did that idea come about, and what negative effects have you seen from churches, ministries that adopt that sort of thinking about work?
You're going to need another little photo clip. You're going to need a bigger memory card for this. Here's what we mean by that. In real simple terms, the sacred-secular dichotomy means that some things are really, really important to God, and other things not so much. The sacred things are the things that are really important to God. And the secular is the stuff that God sort of tolerates, maybe blesses from time to time, but it's just sort of part of the fallen world. Where the idea came from, as far as I can tell, goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks and to the teaching of Aristotle, where Aristotle distinguished between the active life and the contemplative life. The active life was the sphere of work and stuff you got your hands dirty with. The contemplative life was the place for philosophy and reflection and the arts and contemplation. And in Aristotle's view, your highest good could only be accomplished if you were freed up to devote as much of your life as you could to the contemplative side. So the active sphere of life was simply a means to an end. It had no value in and of itself. Combine that with a general view in the ancient world that was very skeptical about the morality of commerce in general. I mean, commerce was largely viewed as being corrupt. And I think for the most part in biblical times that was accurate. Because there were very few morally legitimate ways in which somebody could get ahead financially in the ancient world. It was really hard to do well and do good at the same time. So you combine those two things, and I think what you got in essence was sort of a baptized view of this active life, contemplative life, which became, I think, sort of a secular, sacred, as it was put into a Christian framework in the Middle Ages. Now, in medieval times, it was actually connected to your ability to work and merit your salvation. So the people who were cloistered in a monastery, for example, who were priests, nuns, or monks, not only were doing more for God's kingdom, but they also had a leg up on the average person in terms of meriting their salvation. So when the Reformers came along with their idea of justification by faith alone, it just drove a stake right into the heart of that medieval worldview. Now, unfortunately, what it was replaced with sowed the seeds to see it start over again. Because Luther, in his discussion of the two spheres of the right hand and the left hand of God, put work into the left hand of God, which, again, planted the seeds for it to become secular again. And so I think the sacred-secular divide, even though the Reformers gave their lives to do away with it, it's resurfaced. It started resurfacing probably in the 1800s with the movement, what I would call the movement toward evangelical pietism, which emphasized your own private, devotional, spiritual life, and that was the thing that was overwhelmingly emphasized. So if it didn't contribute to that, it was considered to be secular and of less value. Part of that was because we considered the souls of human beings to be the only thing that lasted forever, which I don't think is true. I mean, our bodies are going to be transformed and last forever, and I think the kingdom will come in a renewed heaven and earth, which will also last forever. So I think it became this view of, rather than contributing to our salvation, it became this view that what has eternal significance. And we assumed that only human souls or things that last forever. Therefore, that's the only thing that had eternal significance. But that's not true. It's much broader than that. I think there's a lot of the world that has eternal significance, and a lot of what we do in our jobs counts for eternity. Because if what we're doing is God's work in the world, analogous to what pastors are doing is God's work in the church, then both of those have eternal significance.